The gun was already cocked when Inez Maddox slammed both palms down on Graham Donnelly's desk and looked him dead in the eye. "Tell me what you know about my husband's murder," she said, "and tell me right now, because I have been in this valley exactly 6 days and every single person I have spoken to has either lied to my face, taken my money, or both." The sheriff did not flinch. He was younger than she expected for a man carrying a badge in a place this rough, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark eyes that held the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago not to show what a thing cost him. He looked at the gun she had pulled from the waistband of her riding skirt, and then he looked at her, and he did not reach for his own weapon. "You going to shoot me, Mrs. Maddox?" he said. "I am considering it." "I figured." He leaned back in his chair, and the old wood creaked under the shift of his weight. "Because you paid Hector Vane $2 for his testimony about the Ridge Road. You paid Clara Finch at the boarding house $4 for the name of the man who argued with your husband the night before he died. You paid Deputy Moss $1.50 just to let you look at the incident report, which I happen to know was missing the most important page." She stared at him. The gun did not lower. "How do you know all of that?" "Because this is my valley," Graham Donnelly said quietly, "and there is not a single conversation that happens inside it that does not eventually find its way back to me." He paused. "Put the gun down, Mrs. Maddox. I am not your enemy, and unlike every other person you have bought information from this week, I am going to tell you the truth for free." The silence between them was enormous, pressing against the walls of that small office like something alive, and Inez felt the trembling in her hands that she had been suppressing for 6 straight days finally threaten to break through. She had held herself together through the train journey from St. Louis, through the stagecoach from Amarillo, through the identification of Thomas Maddox's body at the undertaker's, through 6 days of locked doors and sideways glances and palms turned upward for coin. She had told herself she would not break. She had not broken. But something in the way this man said the word free cracked a hairline fracture straight through her composure. She set the gun on the desk between them. "Then talk," she said. He did. And nothing about Inez Maddox's life would ever be the same. She had arrived in Corado Valley, Texas, in the last week of September, 1883, on a Tuesday morning that smelled of red dust and livestock, and the distant iron-sharp promise of a northern wind coming down off the Llano Estacado. She had never been to Texas before. Thomas had come out ahead of her 18 months ago to establish himself, to build the cattle operation he had spoken about for the 3 years of their marriage, and she had stayed in St. Louis managing the small dress shop she had inherited from her aunt, sending money west every month the way he asked, and waiting for the letter that said, "Come now, everything is ready." The letter that came instead was not from Thomas. It was from a man named Deputy Cyrus Moss, written in cramped, careful handwriting, informing her that her husband, Thomas Elias Maddox, age 34, had been found dead on the eastern ridge road of Corado Valley on the 14th of September, 1883, with a single gunshot wound to the chest. The letter described it as a probable robbery. It said that investigations were ongoing. It offered condolences in the detached, formulaic language of a man who wrote many such letters and had stopped meaning the words a long time ago. Inez had read it 3 times, folded it, put it in the pocket of her apron, and finished serving her current customer. Then she had gone into the back room, sat down on a crate of ribbon spools, and allowed herself 15 minutes of silence that was not quite grief and not quite shock, but something between them both, something harder and colder and more purposeful. Thomas had not been a great love. He had been a steady man, a decent man, a man who kept his word mostly and raised his voice rarely. She had been fond of him. She had respected him. And someone had put a bullet through his chest on a dirt road in Texas and called it probably a robbery and written her a letter. 15 minutes. Then she had stood up, taken off her apron, and started making arrangements. She sold the dress shop to the woman who had been her assistant for 2 years. She packed 2 trunks and a leather valise. She bought a train ticket to Amarillo, and from there arranged passage on the weekly stage to Corado Valley. She brought $300 in cash, which represented nearly everything liquid she had access to, and she brought the small pistol her father had given her when she was 22, which she had never fired at a person but which she kept clean and loaded on principle. She was 28 years old. She was a widow. She was going to find out what had happened to her husband. What she found when she arrived was a town that looked, from the stage road, like possibility. Corado Valley sat in a broad natural bowl between 2 ridges of pale limestone, and the main street had a general store, a land office, a bank, a hotel called the Meridian, a saloon called Heller's, a blacksmith, a church, and a sheriff's office with a fresh coat of white paint on the exterior that someone had taken some trouble over. The surrounding land was good grass country, reddish gold in the September heat, and the cattle she could see from the ridge road were fat and healthy looking. It looked like a place where a man could build something. It looked like the place Thomas had described in his letters. But the moment the stage rolled down the main street and she stepped out in front of the Meridian Hotel with her 2 trunks and her valise, she felt it. The way the 2 men on the porch stopped talking the moment they registered who she was. The way the woman sweeping the boardwalk outside the general store looked at her and then looked quickly away. The particular quality of attention that was not curiosity but calculation. This town knew who she was before she had introduced herself to a single soul. She checked into the Meridian and began asking questions. The first person she asked was Clara Finch, who ran the boarding house on the west side of Main Street and who, according to the stage driver, knew everything about everyone in Corado Valley. Clara Finch was a small, sharp-featured woman of perhaps 50 with ink-dark hair going silver at the temples and the bright, acquisitive eyes of a woman who dealt in information as a primary currency. She was willing to talk, but not for nothing. $2 and she would tell Inez who had been arguing with Thomas the night before he died. Inez paid it. The name was Reuben Crail. Reuben Crail, Clara Finch said, was the man who ran most of the cattle operations east of the ridge, the man who had been trying to buy up grazing rights along the eastern valley floor for the better part of 3 years, and the man who had been very publicly unhappy about Thomas Maddox's refusal to sell the parcel of land along Redwater Creek that Thomas had purchased 16 months ago. Inez wrote the name down and went looking for Hector Vane, the man the hotel clerk had whispered about as someone who had actually been on the Ridge Road the night Thomas died. Hector Vane was a leathery, nervous man who worked at the livery stable and who agreed to speak to her only after she crossed his palm with $2 silver and promised to say she had spoken to him about nothing more concerning than the livery rates. What Hector Vane told her in a very quiet voice in the back of the livery while the horses shifted and blew around them was that he had been on the Ridge Road that night, yes, heading back from his cousin's place, and that he had heard a single shot, and that when he had come around the curve he had seen 2 riders departing at speed heading toward the eastern approach, away from town. He could not identify them. It had been dark. But one of the horses, he was almost certain, was the big gray that Reuben Crail's foreman, a man named Tate, rode everywhere. Almost certain. Not certain enough, it seemed, to take to the deputy without payment, and not certain enough for the deputy to have included it in the incident report, which was missing its 3rd page when Inez paid Deputy Cyrus Moss $1.50 to look at it. Moss was a soft, damp-looking man with a thinning sandy mustache and the expression of someone who had made a great many small compromises over a long period of time and had arranged his face to reflect none of them. He let her look at the report. He did not mention the missing page. He said the investigation was ongoing and that these things took time and that she should not worry herself. She almost shot him in the office right then. She did not, because she was running low on cash and could not afford bail. She had gone back to the Meridian with a name, a possible witness, and a missing page of an official document, all of which added up to a shape she could see but could not yet prove. She had sat at the small writing desk in her room and written everything down in a notebook with a blue cloth cover that she had brought from St. Louis, because she had known, somewhere deep and practical in herself, that this was how it was going to go. Then she had gone to the sheriff's office. She had expected to find a man like Moss or older and worse. She had not expected Graham Donnelly. He told her things, there in that small office with the afternoon light coming golden through the single window, that cost him something. She could see it costing him. He sat with his elbows on the desk and his hands clasped, and he did not look away from her once, and he told her that Thomas Maddox had not died in a robbery. He died, Graham said, because he found out something he was not supposed to know. And because the man who killed him is the same man who has been running this valley like his personal land grant for 12 years, and who has enough of the right people in his pocket to make investigations go sideways. Reuben Crail, Inez said. Graham's jaw tightened. I cannot prove it yet. I want to be clear about that. I know it. I have known it since I looked at the scene on the Ridge Road. But what I know and what I can prove in front of a judge are two different things, and in this valley they are a very wide canyon apart. What did Thomas find out? He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him making a decision. Crail has been running cattle across the Comanche boundary line, Graham said, into land the federal government is supposed to be protecting under treaty provisions. Not that those provisions have meant what they should mean. But more critically, he has been selling those cattle run on land that isn't his and hasn't been cleared for grazing, through a contact in the land office in Amarillo who falsifies the grazing certificates. It is fraud on a scale that involves federal land, federal documents, and enough money to make men with badges look the other way. He paused. Your husband, he said, found documentation. A set of grazing certificates that did not match the land surveys he had done when he bought his parcel on Redwater Creek. Thomas Maddox was, from everything I can determine, a man who kept records. He was going to take those certificates to the federal marshal's office in Amarillo. Inez's hands were very still in her lap. He wrote to me, she said slowly, about 6 weeks before he died. He said he had found something and that he was going to take care of it, and that when it was resolved he would send for me. He did not say what it was. He was careful, Graham said. He was trying to protect you. The word protect landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there, a small hot point of pressure. It did not work, she said. No, Graham said. It did not. They sat in the quiet of that for a moment. Then Inez said, so what do we do? He looked at her again with that particular quality of attention, that stillness, and she noticed things about him that she had not had space to notice while she was managing her anger. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than performance of strength. His face was angular and sun-browned, with a deep line at the left corner of his mouth that suggested he smiled sideways sometimes, privately, at things that struck him as both terrible and absurd. His hands were scarred across the knuckles in a way that spoke of a harder past than the white-painted sheriff's office implied. He wore his badge simply, without the self-conscious swagger she had seen in the deputy, as though it were a tool he had picked up for a specific job and intended to use correctly. She had walked in here ready to point a gun at him. She was not sure what she was ready for now. We find the documentation, Graham said. Thomas had it. If he was as careful as I think he was, he hid it somewhere. His land, the cabin on Redwater Creek. He paused. I was waiting. I did not want to move on it until I had enough to build the full case, and I was worried that someone watching the cabin would report back to Crail if I went out there officially. He met her eyes directly. A widow visiting her dead husband's property is a different thing. You want me to go out to the cabin, Inez said. I want to take you out to the cabin, he corrected, and something in the way he said that was very careful and very precise, as though the distinction mattered to him. I am not asking you to do this alone. She studied him. You have been working this case, she said, since Thomas died. Since before that, Graham said, I have been building a picture of Crail's operation for 7 months. Thomas Maddox's death was not the first thing Crail has done in this valley that I intend to answer for, but it is the one I intend to start with." "Why?" she asked. "What does it cost you? You could look the other way. Everyone else seems to manage it just fine." The line at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Because looking the other way is not something I am constitutionally capable of," he said. "And because I have been sheriff of this valley for 4 years, and I gave a specific answer when I took this job, and I intend to honor it." She thought about all the people who had taken her money for partial truths in the past 6 days. She thought about the missing page and the careful deputy and Clara Finch's bright, acquisitive eyes. "Every answer in this valley had a price," she said slowly. "Except yours." "Yes," said Graham Donnelly simply. She reached across the desk and picked up her pistol and put it back in the waistband of her riding skirt. "All right," she said. "When do we leave?" They rode out to Redwater Creek the following morning, in the pale silver hour before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, when the valley was all long shadows and the smell of dried grass, and the far-off musical sound of cattle, and the world felt large and hushed. Graham Donnelly rode a bay horse named Cortez that moved with the efficient economy of an animal long accustomed to covering difficult ground, and he lent Inez a steady chestnut mare from the livery that the stable owner, who was not Hector Vane, treated with the deference he clearly did not think was wise to refuse the sheriff. They did not talk much at first. The ride from town to the Redwater Creek parcel was roughly 6 miles northeast, and for the first half of it Inez was occupied with managing the chestnut, who had opinions about the pace, and with looking at the land around her and trying to understand what Thomas had seen when he looked at it. It was beautiful, she admitted to herself privately. That surprised her. She had been operating for 6 days in a state of compressed, purposeful anger that did not leave much room for the noticing of beauty, but the valley in the early morning light was genuinely extraordinary. All that pale gold grass running up to the limestone ridges, and the creek line visible ahead as a darker strip of green, cottonwoods and willows trailing their last leaves into the water. "He chose well," she said, not particularly to Graham, just aloud. "He did," Graham said beside her. He was looking at the same stretch of land, and his voice held something that was not quite sadness and not quite respect, but contained elements of both. "It is good land, good water rights. If he had been able to run it, it would have produced. He was supposed to send for me," Inez said. "I was supposed to come out and see it with him. He wrote that the cabin was small but solid and that there was a view from the south window of the creek in the morning." Graham said nothing to that, and she appreciated the fact that he did not try to offer her comfort that would have been hollow. "Did you know him?" she asked. "Thomas?" "Not well. We had spoken a handful of times. He came to me in August to ask about the process for filing a report with the federal marshal's office." Graham paused. "I told him I thought there might be a safer way to proceed. That I was building something, and that if he could wait a few more weeks I might be able to move on it through the proper channels without giving Crail any warning." He was quiet for a moment. "He agreed to wait. He was dead 3 weeks later." She heard it in his voice. "What that cost him." "That is not your fault," she said. "Maybe not," he said, "but it is on my accounting." They rode in silence after that, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It had a quality she could not quite name, something that came from two people who had each, independently, developed the habit of carrying hard things without making them a burden for others to manage. The cabin at Redwater Creek was exactly as Thomas had described it in his letters. Small but solid, built from the local limestone in blocks that had been fitted and mortared with care, with a proper shingle roof and a covered porch facing south toward the creek. Someone, Thomas presumably, had planted a small kitchen garden to the east side that had gone to dry stalks in the weeks since his death. There was a hand-dug well with a good wooden cover. There was a corral fence that was new enough that the wood still held some pale color. She had the key in the pocket of her riding coat. She had carried it from St. Louis in her valise, the key Thomas had sent her with a letter in the spring saying he had made a proper door with a proper lock, not like the rough arrangement he had started with. She fitted into the lock and opened the door. The inside of the cabin smelled of dust and absence. Thomas's things were still here: the narrow bed with the wool blanket folded at the foot, the small table and 2 chairs, the cast iron stove with a coffee pot on it, the trunk at the foot of the bed, the shelf of books he had brought out. A coat on a peg by the door, a pair of boots standing at attention under the bed as though waiting for their owner. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Graham did not press her. He waited on the porch. She went inside. She was practical about it. She was Inez Maddox, who had kept the accounts at the dress shop, who had managed the inventory, who had known to the penny what they owed and what was owed to them, who had kept $300 liquid for emergencies and had been right to do so. She did not have the luxury of falling apart in a dead man's cabin in Texas when there was documentation to find. She went through the trunk first. Clothing, a Bible, a packet of letters tied with string that she recognized as her own letters to him, and underneath everything, a flat leather satchel that was not particularly hidden but had been tucked deliberately under a change of trousers, as though meant to look like nothing in particular. She opened the satchel. Inside were 7 sheets of paper. 4 were grazing certificates, official-looking documents stamped and signed by the Amarillo Land Office. 2 were hand-drawn maps, Thomas's precise surveyor's hand marking out the actual boundary lines of 3 separate land parcels against what the certificates claimed. And the last was a single sheet of paper in Thomas's writing, a list of dates, cattle counts, and a name she recognized: Reuben Crail, and below Crail's name 3 other names. One of them was the deputy's name. She carried the satchel out to the porch. Graham looked at what she was holding, and his expression did something complex and controlled that she was beginning to understand was how his face handled significant moments. He had it organized, Graham said, taking the sheets carefully and beginning to read. He was thorough, Inez said. He was always thorough. Graham read in silence for several minutes. She watched him read, the way his eyes moved across the pages with the focused speed of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for and was finding it. When he finished, he squared the pages carefully and looked up. "This is enough," he said. "Combined with the affidavit I have from a rancher 2 valleys east who saw Crail's operation moving cattle across the boundary line in June, and the testimony of a land office clerk in Amarillo who reached out to me privately last month, this is enough to bring to the federal marshal." She heard the certainty in his voice and felt something in her chest unclench that had been tight since she had read the deputy's letter. "How long?" she said. "If I ride to Amarillo this week with this documentation and the supporting evidence I have already assembled, and if the federal marshal is the man I believe him to be, we are looking at 2 to 3 weeks before warrants are issued." He looked at her directly. "Crail cannot know I have this before then. He has men watching, and if he gets word that this evidence exists and is heading to Amarillo, he will act to suppress it." "What does that mean for me?" she said. "For staying in Corado Valley while you are gone." "It means," Graham said carefully, "that I need to ask you to do something that you may find objectionable." "I have found most things about this valley objectionable so far," she said. "Continue." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I need you to behave as though you found nothing, to stay at the Meridian, to go through the visible motions of a widow settling her husband's estate, to give no indication that you have the documentation, that you spoke to me at length, or that anything is about to happen." She considered this. "You need me to play a role," she said. "I need you to survive the next 3 weeks," he said, and the bluntness of it, the absence of softening, struck her as a form of respect. "All right," she said. "There is one more thing," Graham said. "I need you to give me the documentation now so that I can carry it to Amarillo. If Crail's men search your room at the Meridian, which I consider a genuine possibility, I do not want this found." She looked at the leather satchel in his hands, at Thomas's careful pages, at the evidence of her husband's last significant act before someone had put a bullet through him for it. "Take it," she said. "Do what he meant to do with it." Graham held her gaze. "I will." She believed him. She was not quite sure how she had arrived at that certainty in less than 24 hours of knowing this man, but she was not in the habit of arguing with her own solid instincts. They rode back to town in the warming morning, and he left her at the Meridian with a piece of advice. Eat in the hotel dining room, speak to people in a way that was polite but revealed nothing, and if at any point she felt genuinely threatened, she was to walk directly to the sheriff's office and tell Deputy Moss she needed to leave a message for the sheriff. Moss is compromised, she said. Moss is frightened, Graham said. Those are not the same thing. He will relay a message. He is not willing to die for Crail. He paused. Neither am I asking you to die for this. If it becomes necessary, leave, go to Amarillo. The documentation will still be in motion. I am not leaving, she said. He looked at her in a way that was not surprise exactly, but was something adjacent to it. No, he said. I did not imagine you would be. He left that afternoon, and Corado Valley felt different without him. Smaller somehow. The absence of him had a specific shape that she noticed in an irritated, analytical way, because she was not a woman given to mooning over men she had known for one day, even men who had given her information for free in a valley where every other answer had a price. She was practical about this too. She was a widow. She was in a town where a powerful man had ordered her husband's murder and might, if he became nervous, consider doing the same to her. She had a notebook with blue cloth covers in which she wrote down everything she knew, in a shorthand that only made sense if you already understood the context. She was not precisely safe. She kept to the routines Graham had outlined. She ate in the hotel dining room. She visited the land office and asked, in the heard and seen way, about the process of transferring Thomas's parcel into her name. She went to see the undertaker about Thomas's burial arrangements, which she had not been able to manage in the first days because the cemetery question in Corado Valley was apparently complicated by the fact that the church and the town had different opinions about who owned the burial ground. She navigated this with the patience of a woman who had run a small business and understood that bureaucratic absurdity was a feature of organized human life in any location. She talked to people. She listened more than she talked, which was a habit she had cultivated young and which served her particularly well in places where people were not sure how much she knew. What she learned, over those weeks, was the shape of Reuben Crail's influence in the valley. It was not the blunt, obvious dominance of a man who ruled by threat, though the threat was always present underneath. It was more like weather, the way a persistent wind shapes everything in its path over years, bending the trees and silting up the ditches and becoming so constant that people stopped noticing it and simply adapted their behavior around it. Crail was on the church committee. Crail sponsored the annual cattle drive celebration. Crail had given 3 families low-interest loans when the drought of 1881 had threatened their operations, loans that came with the invisible, never-stated price of convenient blindness about certain things. People were not bad, she thought. They were, most of them, people in circumstances that had worn them into shapes they had not chosen. Clara Finch, with her sharp eyes and her $2 information, was a woman who had been left alone in a hard place and had survived it with the tools available to her. Hector Vane, with his almost certainty, was a man who had seen something and was afraid, not of nothing, but of a specific and credible danger to his person. Even Deputy Moss, who had let a page go missing from an incident report, was not so much a bad man as a small man who had made too many sequential small decisions in the direction of survival until he had arrived somewhere he could not easily come back from. She did not excuse any of them, but she understood them, and understanding made her feel less alone in this place in a way that she found somewhat unexpected. The person she found she most wanted to talk to, and could not, was Graham Donnelly. This she recognized with the clear-eyed self-knowledge that had always been one of her better qualities, and noticed it for what it was without trying to make it into anything more than it was. She had met a man who was honest in a place full of people who were not. She had met a man who had looked at her directly and given her real information at no cost and treated her like someone capable of handling the truth. That these things were striking said something unflattering about the general state of the world, but it also said something accurate about him. She wondered about his dark past, which the line at the corner of his mouth and the scars on his knuckles both suggested he had. She wondered what had brought a man like that to the specific work of being a sheriff in a valley that was more complicated than it looked. She did not, she told herself firmly, wonder about what his voice sounded like when it was not delivering careful, weighted information. She did not think about the angle of his jaw in the morning light on the ride to Redwater Creek. She was a widow of 6 weeks. She had more urgent things to think about. She thought about them extremely effectively for the next 2 weeks. He returned on a Thursday in the 3rd week of October, riding in on Cortez in the late afternoon light, and she knew he was back because the hotel clerk, a boy of about 16 named Pete who had decided she was interesting enough to keep informed about various goings-on, told her breathlessly that the sheriff had ridden in from the Amarillo direction. She was in the hotel dining room with a cup of coffee and her blue notebook when he walked in. He looked tired, the specific tiredness of a man who had covered a great deal of ground in a short time on purpose, but his eyes were clear, and when he saw her they did something that she felt was involuntary, a shift of attention that was almost proprietary and then corrected itself. He sat down across from her without asking, which she thought was about right. "The federal marshal's name is Elias Hartwell," he said, keeping his voice low, "and he is a man who has been watching Crail's operation from the Amarillo end for 8 months. The documentation Thomas assembled was exactly what he needed to complete his own case. Warrants will be issued within the week. Hartwell is riding in personally with a deputy marshal and 2 federal agents." He paused. "It is over, Mrs. Maddox. What your husband started, Hartwell will finish." She put her coffee cup down very carefully. "And Crail will be arrested on charges of federal land fraud, cattle fraud, and conspiracy. The murder charge for Thomas is being handled as a separate matter. Hartwell has a contact in the Texas Rangers who is interested in that case specifically." He met her eyes. "I made a point of ensuring that Thomas Maddox's name and his role in building the evidence were part of the official record." She had not asked him to do that. She had not known to ask for it. The fact that he had done it anyway, had thought to do it, made something in her throat tighten in a way she was obliged to manage very quickly. "Thank you," she said. "He deserved to have it known," Graham said. It was simple and it was true. The arrest came on a Wednesday, 11 days later, which in Inez's experience of the preceding 3 weeks felt approximately like 11 years. She was aware of the strange, compressed suspension of time that comes from waiting for something large and inevitable to arrive, the way you can hear a storm coming across open country for a long time before the first drop of rain. She went about her days. She sorted through the arrangements for Thomas's property. She started a modest, cautious acquaintance with the blacksmith's wife, a woman named Ruth Calloway who had the look of someone who knew a great deal more than she said and was waiting for the weather to change before she said it. She and Graham spoke when circumstances made it natural and otherwise kept their distance, because Graham had explained carefully that if Crail's men saw the widow of the man Crail had ordered killed spending notable amounts of time with the sheriff before any action was taken, it would trigger alarm that could endanger the federal operation. She understood this. She accepted it. She found it considerably more frustrating than she expected to, and she was honest with herself about why. Federal Marshal Elias Hartwell was a compact, gray-haired man with a military bearing and absolutely no patience for procedural nonsense, which Inez appreciated in him immediately. He rode in with 2 deputy marshals and 2 federal agents, all of them on good horses and wearing the specific expression of men who had warrants in their pockets and intended to use them. He stopped in briefly to speak with Graham, who had arranged the coordination, and then the party rode directly to Reuben Crail's ranch house east of town. The arrest of Reuben Crail on charges of federal land fraud and conspiracy was, by all accounts, not dramatically eventful. He was at his ranch house when they arrived. He had not fled, which suggested either that he had not known enough of what was coming or that he had believed himself too insulated to be reached. He was a large man, by the descriptions Inez received afterward from Pete, the hotel clerk, who had apparently developed a gift for being in the right place at the wrong time, with the look of a man accustomed to being the biggest weight in any room. He did not look that way when they brought him into town. Deputy Moss was arrested the same morning on charges of obstruction and evidence tampering. He went quietly, Pete reported. He looked, Pete said with the vivid precision of the very young, like a man who had been expecting it for a long time and was almost relieved. Inez watched from the boardwalk outside the Meridian as they rode in, Crail on a horse with his wrists bound, the federal men around him, Graham riding at the edge of the procession with the expression of a man completing a task he had begun long ago and would be glad to have done with. He caught her eye as he rode past. She gave him a single nod. He returned it. That night the valley felt different. Something had shifted in the air, the particular quality of collective tension that she had felt from the moment she stepped off the stage. A quality she had assumed was simply the atmosphere of the place, the constant low-frequency hum of a community living under pressure it had adapted to but not resolved. It had been so constant she had almost stopped noticing it. Now it was absent, and the absence rang like a clear note. She was sitting on the porch of the Meridian after supper when Graham came to find her. He had washed up and changed his shirt, and he still looked tired, but it was a different kind of tiredness now, the kind that comes after something has been finished rather than the kind that comes from carrying it. He sat down in the second chair without ceremony. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she said. The evening was cool and the stars over the valley were extraordinary, the kind of stars you could only see this far from a city, immense and proliferating and indifferent in the best way, the way the universe was indifferent to small human troubles in a manner that was paradoxically comforting. "What happens now?" she said. "For you, I mean, with Crail gone." Now comes the part where the valley figures out what it is without Crail bending everything toward his interests, Graham said. He was quiet for a moment. "There are people here who made compromises they did not choose from a position of strength. Some of them will come forward. Some of them will have to be given reason to trust that the law is what it is supposed to be and not what Crail made of it." "That sounds like years of work," she said. "It is," he said simply. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the stars with the private sideways expression she had noticed, the one that appeared when he found something both difficult and worth doing. "Graham," she said, and she used his name for the first time without the title and felt it land between them with a specific weight. He turned to look at her. "Why did you tell me?" she said. "The day I came into your office with a gun, you could have been careful. You could have managed me the way everyone else did. What was it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "You came in there with a gun and no illusions," he said. "You had been in this valley 6 days and you had already built a sharper picture of what happened to your husband than most men would have assembled in 6 weeks. You were angry and you were frightened and you were not going to stop, and I recognized that." He paused. "And I thought that if Thomas Maddox had chosen a woman like you, he had more sense than I had given him credit for and that you deserved the truth." Something moved in her chest, slow and warm and not at all uncomplicated. "I was frightened," she said. "I want to be clear about that because I think I was performing competence fairly effectively and it may have read differently." "I know," he said. "You were shaking when you put the gun down, very slightly. You controlled it well." She laughed, which surprised her. It surprised him too, she could see, and it also clearly pleased him, and she thought that was a thing worth knowing about Graham Donnelly, that he was pleased when she laughed. "I would like," she said carefully, "to stay in Corado Valley." He went very still. I have Thomas's parcel on Redwater Creek, she said, keeping her voice even and practical because this was important and she wanted to say it clearly. It is good land and it has water rights, and I am capable of managing a cattle operation if I have the right help establishing it. I sold a dress shop in St. Louis. I know how to run a business. I was going to come out here and do it with Thomas, and now I am going to do it alone if necessary, but—" She paused. "I have found that I do not particularly want everything in this valley to cost something. I find that I have become accustomed to one exception." Graham turned to face her fully. "Mrs. Maddox," he said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, something warmer and less contained than the careful precision he usually employed. "Inez," she said. "Inez," he said, and it sounded entirely different from the way anyone else in this valley had said her name in the past 3 weeks. He did not say anything else immediately. He looked at her in the starlight with an expression that was neither the sheriff's careful assessment nor the guarded privacy she had begun to read in him, but something more direct and more vulnerable than either, and she thought that this was probably what Graham Donnelly looked like when he allowed something to matter. "It would be inappropriate," he said, "given the circumstances, to say certain things." "The circumstances are that I am a widow of 7 weeks," she said. "And you are a man who gave me true information for free in a valley where the going rate for partial truth was $2. I think the circumstances can afford a conversation." "A conversation," he said. "To begin with," she said. Something in the line of his shoulders changed, some long-held tension releasing in a way she suspected he was not entirely aware of. He reached across the space between the chairs and, very deliberately, set his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a considerable while in the cool October evening, under the extraordinary stars of the Texas sky, and Inez thought that this was not how she had imagined this year going, not even slightly, and that it was also, in some way she could not have anticipated or planned for, exactly where she was supposed to be. The weeks that followed were busy in the way that a valley reorganizing itself from the inside out tends to be busy. Federal Marshal Hartwell remained in Corado Valley for 10 days, taking depositions and coordinating with the Texas Rangers on the murder investigation that ran parallel to the land fraud case. The Rangers sent a man named Sergeant Cole Aldridge, who was lean and laconic and systematic, and who spent 2 weeks talking to everyone in the valley, including Hector Vane, who gave a full and formal statement about the gray horse and the 2 riders on the Ridge Road, no longer limited by the protection of $2 silver and a promise of silence. Tate, Crail's foreman, was arrested 11 days after Crail himself. The testimony and physical evidence assembled were sufficient for an indictment. The man who had actually fired the shot was identified as a rider named Brackett who had left the valley the week of Thomas's death, and Aldridge tracked him to Lubbock and made that arrest with a thoroughness that satisfied the law, if not Inez's more complex emotional accounting. Reuben Crail was held in the Amarillo Federal Jail awaiting trial. Deputy Moss entered a formal cooperation agreement in exchange for a reduced sentence. The land office contact in Amarillo was arrested on federal charges that would keep him occupied for the foreseeable future. Graham hired a new deputy, a quiet and competent young man from a town 2 days east named Ellison, who had an honest face and the kind of precise attention to paperwork that suggested he would not be losing any pages from incident reports. Ruth Calloway, the blacksmith's wife, turned out to be exactly what Inez had suspected, a woman who knew a great many things. She became something genuinely important to Inez over those weeks, a friend, which was a thing Inez had not had in Corado Valley and had not expected to acquire. Ruth was practical and funny, and had strong opinions about cattle breeds and about men in general, and about one man in particular. Those opinions delivered in the dry, fond tone of a woman who had spent 20 years watching the valley and had developed a clear picture of its inhabitants. Graham Donnelly, Ruth said one afternoon in late November, when they were drinking tea in the Callaway kitchen while Ruth's husband Edgar made an extraordinary amount of noise doing something with iron in the workshop attached to the house. Came to this valley 4 years ago from Colorado, where he had been a deputy marshal for 3 years before that, and before that a man with what I am told is a genuinely interesting history that he does not volunteer information about. She sipped her tea. He has been asked to supper by most of the unmarried women in this valley and has always declined very politely. He does not drink to excess. He plays chess with the doctor on Friday evenings and loses more often than he admits. He has sent money every month for 4 years to an address in Pueblo, Colorado, which is where his younger brother lives with his wife and their 4 children, because the brother had an accident with a horse 8 years ago that left him unable to work the way he used to. She set her cup down and looked at Inez with the calm, informed gaze of a woman who had done her research. He is a good man, Inez. There are not an overabundance of them. I am just mentioning it. Inez thought about the dark past implied by the scars and the careful precision, and the money sent monthly to Pueblo. Has not said anything, she said. Not formally. He is being correct about the timing. Ruth said. Edgar was correct about the timing when his first wife died, and it took him 3 years to work up to saying anything to me, during which time I had to be excruciatingly patient. She picked up her teacup again. I am simply suggesting that you might not need to wait 3 years. I am not going to wait 3 years, Inez said. Ruth smiled behind her teacup. She did not wait 3 years. She did not, in fact, wait past the first week of December, when she had been in Corado Valley for 2.5 months, and had established herself as the owner of the Redwater Creek property, and had hired a foreman named Delgado who came with excellent references from a rancher in the next county, and who knew cattle the way some people know music, intuitively and completely. She was at the cabin on Redwater Creek, which she had begun in a quiet way to make habitable for someone other than a ghost, when Graham rode out on a Saturday afternoon. He brought her a letter from the federal marshal's office confirming the preliminary trial date for Reuben Crail, which was the kind of letter that required delivery in person only if you were looking for a reason to ride 6 miles in December. She accepted the letter, read it on the porch, and said, "You could have sent this with Ellison." "I could have," he agreed. She looked at him. He had his hat in his hands, and he was standing at the base of the porch steps in a way that she thought was probably the most uncertain she had seen him, which in a man who carried himself with the particular compact sureness of someone who had made hard decisions in difficult places and stood behind them, was a notable thing. "Graham," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said on the porch of the Meridian in October." "I have also been thinking about what I said on the porch of the Meridian in October," she said. "I want to be clear about what I am," he said, and the particular serious weight of it, the way he planted himself in it, made her pay close attention. "I am a man who made a number of significant errors in his 20s and has spent the years since conducting himself in a way that he hopes counts for more than the errors did. I am a man who is not rich and does not expect to be. I have a job I intend to keep doing well for as long as this valley needs me to do it, which may be longer than is entirely comfortable. I am not," he said, "a simple proposition." "Neither am I," she said. "I am a widow with a cattle operation in its first year, and a notebook full of documented corruption, and a pistol I keep loaded on principle." He looked at her, and the line at the corner of his mouth moved into the private sideways expression that she had catalogued as belonging to things that were both difficult and worth doing. "Would you," he said, "be willing to have supper with me, not at the Meridian, at the doctor's house, where Doc Reeves and his wife have very pointedly invited both of us for Saturday evening for reasons I believe have everything to do with the fact that this valley has been watching us navigate this for 2 months and has formed opinions." She thought about Ruth Calloway's knowing eyes and her 3 years of patient speech. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing to have supper." The supper at Doc Reeves's house, was the first time she had seen Graham in a context that was not professional, not the sheriff's office or the porch of the Meridian or the ride to Redwater Creek, and it rearranged certain things she thought she had figured out about him. He was easy in the company of people he trusted, easy in a way she had not seen before, and he talked about things that were not the valley and its troubles and the law, talked about the chess games with the doctor, and a book he was reading, and a memory of winter in Colorado that was funny in a dry, specific way that made Doc Reeves's wife Mary laugh until she had to put down her fork. And he listened to her. Not in the careful, assessing way of the sheriff gathering information, but in the way of someone who was genuinely interested in what she was saying, who followed her train of thought and asked questions that showed he had been paying attention 3 sentences back, who found her funny and was not shy about letting her see that he did. She drove herself back to the Meridian that night because Graham's horse was at the doctor's end of town, and she had the buggy she had bought for the Redwater Creek work. And he walked her to it in the cold December night and stood at the side of the buggy and looked at her in a way that made it very clear what he was thinking, and very clear that he was going to continue being correct about the timing. She looked at him for a moment. Then she leaned down from the buggy seat and kissed him once, briefly and with complete intention, and he was very still for a moment before he reached up and caught her face in his hands and kissed her back properly in a way that was warm and careful and thorough and had nothing correct about it whatsoever. She straightened up. He looked at her. The December cold was significant and neither of them mentioned it. "Supper again," she said. "Thursday." "Thursday," he said. She drove back to the Meridian. In the spring of 1884, the trial of Reuben Creel began in Amarillo. Inez attended, as a witness, and as the widow of the man whose evidence had made the prosecution possible. Graham accompanied her, not as her escort precisely, but as the sheriff whose work was central to the federal case, and who happened to sit beside her in the courthouse, and whose hand she held through 3 days of testimony, in a way that did not go unnoticed by the reporters from 2 different Texas newspapers who had come to cover the trial. It was reported that a rancher named Tate and a writer named Brackett had been charged with the murder of Thomas Inez Maddox, acting under instruction from Creel. It was reported that the evidence assembled by Maddox himself, combined with the work of the Corado Valley Sheriff and the Federal Marshal's Office, had produced what the prosecuting attorney described as an unusually complete documentary record of the fraud operation. It was reported that Reuben Creel, facing federal charges of land fraud and conspiracy and the state charge of directing a murder, showed no expression during the reading of the evidence. He was convicted. On the day the verdict came in, Inez and Graham were outside the courthouse in the Amarillo afternoon. The sky was high and blue and tremendous, the kind of sky that Texas does particularly well, and the April light was warm on the limestone buildings and the busy street, and the people moving in and out of the courthouse with the energized, purposeful quality of a legal proceeding reaching its conclusion. Graham said, "It is done." She thought of Thomas, methodical Thomas, who had seen something wrong and had written it down, and had tried to address it through the proper channels, and had paid for that attempt with his life. She hoped, in the very specific and private way of her inner life, that whatever came after death was real enough for a man to know when the accounting was settled. She thought he would have been satisfied with the settlement. "Yes," she said, "it is done." Graham took her hand in the way that had become, over the past 4 months, something natural and expected, and not any less significant for being either of those things. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him, this man with his dark eyes and his honest answers and his hand holding hers in the April sunshine outside a courthouse in Amarillo, Texas. "Ask," she said. "I want to ask you," he said, "if you would consider marrying me. Not immediately if the timing is not right for you. Not in a way that asks you to be anything other than what you are. But I want to ask." He paused. "I want you to know that I intend to ask, so that you can account for it in your plans." She thought of all the answers in the valley that had come with prices, the $2 information and the $1.50 incident report, and the $4 name and the particular economy of a place where knowledge was currency. She thought of a man who had looked at her across a desk and told her the truth for nothing. "Graham Donnelly," she said, "you are the worst negotiator I have ever met." He looked slightly alarmed. "You were supposed to build to that," she said. "You were supposed to let me wonder. You were not supposed to just say it like you are reporting a cattle count." The line at the corner of his mouth appeared. "I'm not very good at not saying what I mean," he said. "No," she agreed. "You are absolutely terrible at it. It is one of your more unreasonable qualities." She tightened her grip on his hand. "Yes." The single syllable sat between them in the warm April air. "Yes," he said, as though he was testing whether it was real. "Yes," she confirmed. "Accounting for it in my plans, beginning immediately." He laughed, which she had heard before but not often enough. A real laugh that had the quality of something not often let out into the air. And she thought she was going to make a considerable project of hearing that laugh as frequently as possible. He pulled her into him and kissed the top of her head, which was the most public display of affection she had observed from him, and which she suspected cost him something in terms of self-containment, and which she filed away as important information. They were married in June of 1884. The wedding was in the Corado Valley church, on a Saturday when the early summer light was long and golden, and the valley was all grass and sky, and the sound of a creek running clear. Ruth Calloway stood with Inez, wearing a good dress she had made herself, and looking deeply satisfied in the way of someone whose advice about not waiting 3 years had proven sound. Doc Reeves stood with Graham. The entire town came, which surprised Inez and did not, on reflection, surprise her, because Corado Valley had been watching this particular story with active investment for 7 months. She wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a dressmaker in Amarillo, a deep blue that Graham, when he saw her, looked at in a way that required no interpretation whatsoever. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Payne, who was a direct and unsentimental man of the cloth that Inez found she appreciated enormously, and who made the vows feel like what they were. A serious promise between two serious people who had arrived at this point through a combination of grief and purpose and honesty, and the particular chemistry that happens when two people have been through a genuinely difficult thing together, and come out the other side still finding each other indispensable. She said her vows clearly. Graham said his in the same tone he used for every important thing, direct, specific, and entirely meant. Afterward, there was a gathering in the churchyard that turned gradually into something festive, with food that the women of the valley had contributed and music from a fiddle player Edgar Calloway had apparently located with the thoroughness he applied to good iron, and the particular warmth of a community that was, slowly and unevenly, and with the normal human complications of the process, finding its way back to something better than it had been. Clara Finch was there. Inez spoke to her, briefly and without rancor, because she had arrived at a considered position about Clara Finch, that she was a woman who had made the best use of the tools available to her in a valley where the normal protections had been compromised, and that this was not nothing. Hector Vane was there, and he shook Graham's hand with the expression of a man who felt, now that the thing was done, that his conscience was somewhat cleaner. Deputy Ellison was there, with his honest face and his reliable paperwork. The doctor and his wife were there, and Mary Reeves danced with the particular joy of a woman who had been right about something from the beginning and was not remotely ashamed of knowing it. Inez danced with Graham, which she had not known until that evening was a thing Graham did, and he did it well, with the same quality he brought to everything he did well, without show, efficiently and with full attention to what he was doing. "You did not tell me you could dance," she said. "You did not ask," he said. "I am going to need a comprehensive list," she said, "of things you are capable of that you simply have not mentioned." "That would take some time," he said. "We have some time," she said. He looked at her in the summer evening light in the churchyard of Corado Valley, with his hand at her waist and the fiddle playing something slow, and the people of their valley around them. "Yes," he said, "we do." The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that fills itself up without announcing its fullness until you look back at it and realize how much has been contained. The Redwater Creek property took shape under Delgado's management and Inez's oversight. The first season's cattle doing better than the conservative estimate and well enough to make the second season viable. She kept her notebook, not for evidence now but for accounts, though she had discovered that the habit of writing things down precisely translated perfectly from one application to the other. Graham continued as sheriff. The valley was quieter without Crail's influence bending everything, though quieter did not mean simple, because nothing in a working community of that size and variety ever became simple. There were disputes between neighbors about fence lines and water access. There was a brief but significant problem with horse theft in the fall that required Graham to ride 3 days east and return with 3 men in wrist irons, who had been working a circuit across 4 counties. There was an ongoing effort to establish what amounted to a local governance structure that did not depend on the whims of one wealthy man, a process that was slow and contentious and necessary, and that Graham and Inez were both involved in. He from the side of law and she from the side of the growing business community that was finding its feet. Ruth Calloway became the kind of friend that makes a place feel like home in a way that a house alone never quite can. They drank a great deal of tea together, in Ruth's kitchen and in the kitchen of the house at Redwater Creek that Inez was gradually making into something she was proud of, adding to the original limestone structure as they had the resources for it. A proper second room, a good stove, curtains she made herself from fabric she special ordered, because she had been a dressmaker and she had opinions about fabric. In the second year of their marriage, in November of 1885, she told Graham she was expecting their first child. He was at the desk in the sheriff's office doing paperwork when she came in and sat down across from him, and she watched the information arrive in his face in the way that important things arrived in Graham Donnelly's face. Slowly, processing from the front toward the interior, and then fully present. He stood up from the desk and came around it and held her face in his hands, and looked at her for a moment, and then he sat down on the edge of the desk and pulled her close, and held on to her in a way that was less about romance and more about the specific weight of something enormous landing on a person who understands its full significance. "Are you well?" he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "Very well," she said. He exhaled, long and controlled. "Good," he said, and then, after a moment, "Good." Their son was born in the summer of 1886 on a hot July morning at the Redwater Creek house, delivered by Doc Reeves with Ruth Calloway present because Ruth had made it clear that she intended to be there, and neither Inez nor Graham had any argument with this. He was a large, healthy boy who announced his arrival in a way that the entire household, including Delgado in the barn and the 2 ranch hands in the corral, could not possibly be uninformed about. Graham, who had been outside on the porch doing the specific pacing of a man who has been told to remain outside, and who is finding this instruction deeply at odds with his instincts, came in when Doc Reeves called him, and stood at the bedside of his wife, and looked at the son she was holding, and did something with his face that she had never seen before, and that she recognized immediately as the expression of a man who has just discovered a new category of feeling that has no prior reference. She had been awake for 12 hours and was exhausted in a way that was also, paradoxically, completely alert, and she watched him look at their son. "Thomas," she said, "if that is all right with you." He looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way that he made no attempt to manage. "Thomas," he said. "Yes." Thomas Donnelly was a loud, certain, opinionated infant who grew into a loud, certain, opinionated small boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's particular quality of stillness that appeared when he was thinking hard about something. He was followed, 3 years later, by a daughter they named Clara, not for Clara Finch though Inez noted the coincidence with some amusement, but for Graham's mother, who had died when he was 19 in the harder history that lived in the Colorado years, he had begun to tell her about, piece by piece, in the long evenings of their marriage. He told her things slowly, not from reluctance exactly, but from the habit of a man who had always sorted through his interior life privately, and was still learning with her that there was another option. The errors of his 20s, a period working for a man who turned out to be less lawful than his appearance suggested, a mistake made in the specific way of someone who trusted the wrong person and paid for it in ways that included the scars on his knuckles. The deaths he had not been able to prevent, and the ones he had, the reckoning with what kind of man he intended to be that had happened somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, in a winter he described as the most useful and most miserable of his life. She listened and offered him the same quality of attention he had always given her, the kind that followed 3 sentences back, the kind that asked questions from actual interest. And she told him things too, the shape of her own life before Corado Valley, the marriage to Thomas that had been decent and not quite deep, the dress shop and the accounts, and the 15 minutes on the crate of ribbon spools, the iron-cold decision to come to Texas with $300 and a loaded pistol. "You walked into my office," he said one evening, years into the marriage, when they were sitting by the fire at Redwater Creek with Thomas asleep in the next room, and Clara making small exploratory sounds in her cradle that would shortly become large, unambiguous sounds. "And you put your hands on my desk and looked me in the eye with a gun in your hand, and I thought in that moment, well, something is about to change." She looked at him in the firelight. "Is that what you thought?" "Also that I should probably address the gun," he said. She laughed, and little Clara in her cradle made a sound that might have been an opinion about the laughter, and Thomas shifted in the next room, and the fire settled in the grate with the sound of something satisfied. "You gave me the truth," she said, "for free, in a valley where everything costs something." "You were owed the truth," he said. "Most people are." "You gave it to me specifically," she said. He looked at her, the firelight on his angular face and the private sideways line at the corner of his mouth. "Yes," he said, "to you specifically. The valley changed over those years in the way that places change when the thing distorting them is removed. It was not sudden, and it was not uniformly positive, because the removal of a corrupt influence does not automatically fill the space with uncomplicated good, but the direction of it was clearly different. The land that Crail had been fraudulently running cattle on was restored to its proper classifications, which involved some complicated negotiations with federal representatives, and with the Comanche people whose lands had been the outer edge of Crail's operation. And Graham was involved in those negotiations in the capacity of a man who had documented the original injustice, and believed that documentation carried a moral obligation to see the remedy through, not simply the legal one. The saloon changed ownership to a woman named Ida Morrow, who ran it with a firm and unsentimental hand that improved its general character considerably. The church and the town resolved their cemetery dispute, finally, through the mediation of Doc Reeves, who was widely trusted by both parties for the simple reason that he had stitched up members of both and kept their confidences. A school was established in the 3rd year after Crail's removal, in a building donated by 3 of the valley's ranchers who had, it turned out, been waiting for the right conditions before investing in something that Crail's influence had always made feel precarious. Inez was on the school's founding committee. She was also, by the 5th year, one of the more substantial cattle operations in the valley, which was something that required management and attention, and the continued exercise of the particular precise intelligence that had served her well from the dress shop accounts in St. Louis, through the 6 days of evidence gathering in a hostile town, through the annual calculations of what a cattle operation could sustain and what it needed to grow. She was not the only woman running a serious business in Corado Valley by then, but she had been one of the first, and she was aware that this mattered in the particular way that being first at something matters, not as a personal distinction exactly, but as a practical demonstration that changes what people believe is possible. Ruth Calloway told her so directly one afternoon, in the way Ruth had of stating things that were true but had not been said aloud. "You are the reason," Ruth said, "that Ida Morrow felt she could bid on the saloon. You are the reason that Clara Jenkins felt she could go to the bank for the loan for the millinery. They looked at you, and they saw that it was possible." "I looked at me and I saw that I had no alternative," Inez said. "That is usually how the first ones do it," Ruth said. "The ones after can afford to think about it more carefully." Thomas started school in the autumn of the year he turned 6 and came home on the first day with the expression of a person who has encountered a system they intend to understand completely and then exceed. He was, in the opinion of his teacher and both of his parents, alarmingly competent at reading and mathematics, and slightly less interested in sitting still than any of them would have preferred. Clara was quieter than her brother, a child who listened before she spoke and who had, from very early, the habit of watching adults with the specific serious attention of someone who was already making assessments. She looked like her father around the eyes, the particular stillness, and she had her mother's way with a direct question. She asked it exactly, without preamble, and waited for a complete answer. "Why did you come to Corado Valley?" She asked her mother one morning, not out of nowhere, but in the way of a child who had been thinking about something for a while and had arrived at the question. Inez looked at her daughter. "Because your father Thomas, not this Thomas," she said, gesturing toward her son who was at the table eating bread with complete concentration. "The man I was married to before died here and I came to find out what happened." Clara considered this. "And then you stayed," she said. "And then I stayed," Inez agreed. "Because of Papa," Clara said. "Because of many things," Inez said. "And yes, because of your father." Clara appeared to find this satisfactory. She ate her breakfast. Graham came in from the barn, where he had been doing the morning round with Delgado, and washed his hands at the basin and took the coffee she had poured for him. And she looked at him in the morning light of their kitchen. This man she had walked in on with a gun and righteous anger and $300 and no expectation whatsoever of this particular destination, and felt the thing that she had come to understand over 6 years of marriage was the specific weight of being known. Not perfectly. Not without the ordinary friction of two people who were both precise and strong-willed, and occasionally exhausted by the same world in incompatible ways. Not without the recurring conversation about whether Graham was spending too many evenings at the sheriff's office, and the other recurring conversation about whether Inez was taking on too many projects simultaneously, both of which conversations they had arrived at the mutual recognition of as the conversations they were always going to be having, because they were both people who took on more than was comfortable and expected each other to keep up. But known. Understood in the particular way that someone understands you when they have watched you handle the full range of circumstances, the easy ones and the terrible ones, and the merely difficult ones and the ones that are absurd, and they keep choosing you with that complete information. She refilled her own coffee cup and sat across from him at the table, and Thomas pushed the bread toward her without being asked, because he had noticed she had not taken any yet, which was a thing she was going to think about later as evidence of something in his character that gave her satisfaction. And Clara climbed down from her chair and went to look at something outside the window that had caught her attention. "Delgado says the north pasture fence needs attention before winter," Graham said. "I know," Inez said. "He mentioned it to me yesterday. I am going to ride out with him Thursday to look at it." "I could ride out with you," he said. "You could," she said. "If you can get away from Ellison for a morning." "I can get away from Ellison for a morning," he said. "He is running the place more effectively than I did when I started, and I have come to terms with this." She smiled at him over her coffee cup. This was what she had not known to want in the years before. Not the grand romantic gesture, not the arrival of someone to rescue her from difficulty, but this. The ordinary partnership of two people who respected each other enough to tell each other the truth and who had built, out of grief and purpose and honesty, and the specific kind of love that grows between people who choose each other daily and mean it, something worth keeping. In the autumn of that year, 1892, 9 years after she had stepped off a stage in Corado Valley with 2 trunks and a valise and a cold, purposeful fury, she and Graham rode out to the Redwater Creek property on an October morning that was a precise echo of the morning they had ridden there together the first time. The same pale silver light, the same smell of dried grass and the iron-sharp edge of a northern wind coming off the Llano Estacado. Thomas, 11 now and deeply interested in everything about the land, rode with them. Clara, 9, sat in front of Graham on Cortez, who was older now and moved with the considered dignity of a horse who understood his own importance. They came over the ridge and looked down at the Redwater Creek property, at the limestone house that had grown from the small cabin of Thomas Maddox's solitary occupancy into something that looked, in the October light, like a place that had been lived in well and intended to be lived in further. The garden was properly established now. The corrals were solid. There was a second structure, a working barn, and the fence lines ran straight and true across the valley floor. "Your mother's cattle," Graham said to Thomas, who was at his side, "have paid for more of what you see than you might think." Thomas, who was already interested in the accounts, though he expressed this interest with the particular nonchalance of an 11-year-old determined to appear as though things were interesting rather than showing that he cared too much, looked at the land with the assessing eyes of a child who was going to grow into someone who understood value in its multiple senses. "Did you know," Thomas said, "that the north pasture has better grass than the south because of the way the creek bends?" "I did know that," Inez said. "How did you know that?" "Delgado told me," Thomas said. "He is teaching me about the water table." Graham looked at her over Thomas's head with the expression of a man witnessing something inevitable and deeply satisfying. Clara, from the front of Graham's saddle, said, "I want to see the creek." They rode down. The creek was clear and cold in the October air, running over the smooth, flat stones that Thomas Maddox had walked beside in the months before he died, working a property he had believed in and building toward a future he had not lived to occupy. Inez stood at the bank and watched her children and her husband at the edge of the water, Thomas throwing stones with the expert's instinct for angles, Clara crouching to examine something on the bank with her mother's precise, investigative attention, Graham standing with his hands in his coat pockets, watching both of them with the expression he always had when he looked at his family. That particular quality of a man who knows exactly what he has, and is grateful for it in a way that runs too deep for casual expression. She thought about the blue notebook with the cloth cover, which still existed, filled from cover to cover now with not evidence but other things. The accounts of the cattle operation, notes from the school committee meetings, a letter she had drafted to the federal marshal's office when the question of the boundary land had come up again for review, a sketch she had made one evening of the view from the south window, the one Thomas had mentioned in his letter. She thought about the sheriff sitting across the desk from her with his hands clasped and his dark eyes direct, giving her the thing everyone else in the valley had a price for, giving it freely, giving it because she was owed it. Every answer in this valley had a price except the one the sheriff gave her for free, and out of that one free answer, out of the truth offered without negotiation in a small white-painted office on a Tuesday afternoon in September, had come everything she could see from where she was standing. Graham came to stand beside her. "What are you thinking?" he said. She considered telling him the whole of it and decided it was both too large and too obvious to need saying in its entirety. "I am thinking," she said, "that I would like to plant an apple tree next spring, by the south wall where the sun hits longest." He looked at her. "An apple tree," he said. "For the children," she said. "And for the keeping of it." He was quiet for a moment. "We would need to get the stock from somewhere that grows them," he said, which was the practical response of a practical man, the response she had expected, and which she also knew contained within it his yes. "I will write to a nursery in Amarillo," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they watched their children by the creek in the October light, in the valley that had asked a price for everything, and received from them everything it had asked, and had given back, in the slow and unannounced way of places that become home, something worth considerably more than the exchange. Thomas skipped a stone 6 times across the surface of the creek and turned to show them with the unself-conscious satisfaction of a child who has done a thing and wants his people to know it. Inez raised her hand in acknowledgement. Graham made a sound that was low and approving, and Thomas turned back to the creek to do it again, because that was enough. The apple tree was planted the following April, a small and determined thing set into the south wall of the limestone house, with the care of something that would take years to become what it was meant to be. Inez put it in the ground herself, with Thomas helping in the way of an 11-year-old who is genuinely useful, but needs to be given specific tasks, and Clara standing nearby with a bucket of water and the serious attention she brought to things she had decided mattered. Graham watched from the porch with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who is watching something worth watching. When the tree was in and tamped firmly into the red Texas earth, Inez straightened up and looked at it, small and bare-limbed and entirely unimpressive in its current state. "It will take 3 years to produce," she said. "Most good things do," Graham said from the porch. She looked at him. He was smiling, not the private sideways expression she had catalogued in the early days, but the full one, the one she had worked at and won over 6 years of marriage and 2 children and apple trees and cattle accounts, and the daily accumulated evidence of a life built on honesty and freely given trust. She walked up the porch steps and took his coffee cup from his hand and drank from it, which she had been doing for 6 years without asking, because she had decided early that asking every time was an inefficiency, and he had decided with equal clarity that he did not mind, and this small domestic fact was in its way as much a love story as any of the rest of it. She gave him back the cup. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since a Tuesday in October of 1883 in a white-painted office with afternoon light through a single window, directly, completely, without price. "Graham," she said. "Inez," he said. There was nothing that needed to follow it. They had said everything in 6 years of marriage, and before that in the extraordinary compressed weeks when the valley had arranged itself around them, and there was nothing left unspoken that required speaking. She sat down beside him on the porch. Their children's voices came from the yard, Thomas instructing Clara on something with the authority of the elder, and Clara responding with the precision of the younger who has learned to ask the right questions. The apple tree stood in the south wall sunshine, small and patient and intending, in 3 years or so, to become something worth having. The valley lay around them, Corado Valley, in the April of 1893, 10 years from the Tuesday she had arrived on a stage with a valise and a pistol, and the cold, purposeful intention of finding out what had happened to a man she had been fond of in a place she had never seen. It was not the valley it had been. It was not perfectly resolved, because valleys and communities and human beings do not resolve perfectly, and the pretense that they do is itself a form of deception. But it was better, and the direction of it was clearly good, and the school had its second cohort of children in it, and the fence lines ran straight, and the creek at Redwater ran clear over its smooth, flat stones. She had come looking for an answer. She had found one she had not known to look for. She had found a man who, in a place where every answer had a price, had looked at her and given her the truth because she was owed it for free, and had not asked for anything in return. And from that one free answer, she had built something she had not known to want and would not now trade for anything the world had to offer. The afternoon settled around the porch. The coffee was shared. The children argued amiably about something in the yard. The apple tree stood in its good southern sun and did the patient work of putting down roots. Inez Maddox Donnelly leaned her head on her husband's shoulder. Graham Donnelly, Sheriff of Corado Valley, set his coffee cup on the porch railing and put his arm around his wife and looked out at all of it, the work of years made visible in the land around them, and held on. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough.